Hey YouTube, this is Archangel for Truth. And today my audio recording for you is when the state's compelling safety concern protects us from our rights and our freedoms. Well, as you see here in this image of this man that is completely wrapped in bubble wrap, this is exactly the kind of thing that if the states were allowed to, they would have us pretty much in this circumstance. Now, I grew up in an age where, we were able to ride in the back of a pickup truck without any seatbelts or, there are things that we were able to do, ride our bicycles without helmets and so forth. Ultimately, the state would utilize a safety issue to establish some sort of regulation, and because, hey, we want to be safe and so forth. And in some ways, that's a good thing, but in other ways, it's a bad thing. Now, I want to preface this by reminding everybody, of course, that what I am about to speak about is basically only my opinions and my expressed views, and that I am not a licensed attorney, nor is this legal advice. But ultimately, I'm just saying how I feel about the issue of safety. Man is the only species on this planet that somehow seems to think that they have to intercede in other people's lives to tell other people what they can and cannot do, or they just seem to have to involve themselves in the decisions and the freedoms of other people. And we observe this happening over there in Afghanistan right this moment. You have this group with guns, the Taliban, that want to force people against their will to certain standards or certain things that they want to hold to. Well, in a similar fashion, we have the same thing existing here in the States. Regardless of whichever state you're in, you're going to have law enforcement with guns again enforcing or forcing these statutory regulations that states are ultimately trying to justify as a justification why they can violate your rights on issues such as a safety concern. And so ultimately, we're also seeing this playing out as it pertains to the I'm going to call it the 666 virus, but you all know what I'm talking about, right? And how it is that, they want you to get the jab and they want you to wear a mask and do all these safety concerns that they want to throw out there. But, here's the deal. There was a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth for millions of years, and all with no masks and no jabs. Imagine that. But man is manipulating with nature. and creating things that are not natural, and then expecting everybody else to follow some safety procedures that they are insisting upon, all in violation of your rights. You see, so now to help you understand this scenario, you have to understand the court's test that they're ultimately doing in establishing the constitutionality of a safety concern that the state is trying to force upon everybody else. So there are what is called this three-prong test, and the most difficult of this prong is what is called strict scrutiny. Then there's intermediate scrutiny and rational basis. And within each of those tests, there's going to be a question as pertaining to its purpose. So, for example, the strict scrutiny, the judiciary is going to ask, well, is the regulation that is being put forth by the state, does it have a compelling purpose? And for the intermediate scrutiny, it's going to ask is whether or not it has an important purpose. And then the least or the easiest prong, if you will, of that test is the rational basis. And there it's going to simply ask is whether or not it has a legitimate purpose. And so ultimately you have to understand that what the court is doing is it's trying to find whether or not there is an excuse why the state can violate, maybe it's your constitutional rights, or maybe it's your inalienable rights, or your unenumerated rights, or your natural rights. And so that is the three-prong test that the courts will use. Now, they call it a test. I call it an excuse. And so ultimately the reason being is because, let me put it to you this way. This is a very important question. And I know this is an issue that, those that agree with states having authority over people and government having authority over people they will not get this. But for those that do stand for the freedoms and the rights that we have, you're going to understand this a lot better. But ultimately, the question really comes down to this. Do we have an inalienable, unenumerated, natural right not to be regulated or controlled by a government? That is a question the courts do not wish to answer. Or if they're going to answer it, they're going to come up with some sort of method like this three-prong test to sidetrack that issue, you see. Because ultimately what they're doing is, they'll even for those constitutional rights that they will say you have, they will use varying tests to say, well, you have that right, but we're going to go ahead and regulate that right. That's the problem. Because when your rights are no longer being protected by the government, that's what the intention of government was laid out for, as many of you well know, as this was so articulated by the founding fathers. And so one of the things that they pointed out as those truths that are self-evident is that people have an absolute right to abolish or reject a government that no longer is protecting their rights. And so ultimately, this is why it's very important for us to understand, whether or not we have that right not to be regulated. And I certainly say that we do. Certainly, I would say our rights existed before regulations ever did. And, think about it from the standpoint from the time that the founders first came to this land and started to build for themselves their lives and build homes and so forth. I guarantee you there were no building codes that they followed. And ultimately they were able to live unregulated by the government. Now, maybe England puts some varying regulations upon them, but ultimately those regulations that were there were rejected and were something that the founding fathers eventually fought against. So if they could reject it, so can we. And so that is the argument that is there. That is something that the courts are attempting to basically they're using a court case that Marbury versus Madison, in where Supreme Justice Marshall was talking about that it's a court's duty to determine what the laws are. Now, even if we accept that opinion, let us point out the fact that this is an opinion of one man, nothing else. And his opinion, regardless of his role as a Supreme Justice, does not carry any greater weight than anyone else. And therefore, it does not establish that what they're trying to imply by that opinion of Judge Marshall as being that, well, as a result of that, the courts can now all of a sudden determine what our rights are. That is not what Judge Marshall said in his opinion there. Because ultimately, even if they do make interpretation as it pertains to law, that is a difference between the interpretation as it pertains to law compared to the interpretation as to what it pertains to rights. Two very distinct things. And so this is something that many that want to use case law as a justification as to why the government can do this or that. They'll always go to case law, but ultimately case law is only some individuals' opinions that they're saying, well, this is acceptable because we feel it's acceptable. Well, hey, guess what? We have our own opinions, and our opinions are equally as valuable or equally as enforceable, as the opinions of an individual wearing a black robe. It's just whether or not we're willing to stand up for these rights and freedoms of ours. And so that's what we must do. We must absolutely do that. As it pertains to the judiciary, if you've seen my previous audio recording, I pointed out that the far majority of their decisions are wrongly decided because, as I state, it doesn't take into consideration certain things such as our unenumerated rights. It doesn't take into consideration whether or not we have the right not to be regulated. And again, if this is our right, they have no right to take it away from us. Our rights are inherent to us. They come from our Creator, and they are gifts from Him to us. And it is not the purpose of government to take away rights. The purpose of government is there to protect rights. So with that all being said, I hope that gives a little better understanding for all of those of you who hear my videos or my recordings. And I hope you enjoy this. So you all take care and God bless.